Good day, everyone. My name is Marve Lumagod, and I'm going to discuss the continuation of the topic test of control. So we have one type of evidence not sufficient. One type of audit gathering technique may not be sufficient to properly test the effectiveness of controls. Inquiry alone will not provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So sinasabi dito na hindi enough ang isang procedure para makakuha ng isang sufficient audit evidence. So test of controls ordinarily include those procedures used to evaluate the design of controls and frequently include reperformance of the application of the control by the auditor. So in here, the auditor uses combination of procedures or test of controls gaya ng inquiry, observation, inspection, and reperformance to obtain sufficient audit evidence. So in order for them to get enough relevant evidence, auditors need to perform various procedures. So let's take an example. An auditor observes a certain process in a business to attest the efficiency of the process or to test the effectiveness of the process. However, observation alone may not be enough to gather evidence since observation is pertinent only at a point in time in which it is made. So, ibig sabihin, the information that you get is limited only to what you observe in that certain time. So, to make evidence more relevant and reliable, the auditor's observation may be supported with inquiries of entity personnel and inspection of documentation. So we have substantive test and control test. The auditor may use test of details or transaction of transaction as test of controls in responding to the risk assessment. So the objective of test of details performed as test of controls is to evaluate whether a control is operated effectively, while the objective of test of details performed as substantive procedures is to detect material misstatements in the financial statements. So next, we have timing of test of controls. The timeliness of evidential matter is about when the evidence was obtained and the portion of the audit period to which it may be applied. So the timing of test of controls refer to when they are performed and the part of the accounting period to which they relate. So the auditor shall test controls for the particular time or throughout the period for which the auditor intends to rely on those controls. So we have interim period test. When the auditor obtains audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of controls during an interim period, he should also determine what additional audit evidence should be obtained for the remaining period. So the auditor should also obtain audit evidence about significant changes to those controls subsequent to the interim period. Also, the auditor should consider the audit evidence obtained during the interim period and the length of the remaining period, the additional audit evidence obtained from substantive procedures performed in the remaining period. So next, we have a prior period test. If the auditor plans to use audit evidence about controls obtained in prior audits, he should determine whether changes in those controls have occurred since the prior audit. So the auditor should consider the length of the time period that may elapse before retesting the control. And in using evidence obtained in the prior audit, the auditor should consider the effectiveness of the elements of internal control, including risk assessment process. Also, the auditor should consider the risk from the control. It may be manual or automated. And another one is general IT controls effectiveness. And next, control effectiveness and its application, including nature and deviation in the application noted in previous audits. And the auditor should also consider if there are any personnel changes which may affect the controls application. However, if no changes, the auditor should test the control at least once in every third audit, and some controls each audit to test effectively. So next we have controls that have changed. If the auditor plans to rely on controls that have changed since they were last tested, he should test these controls in the current audit. So, if there have been changes that affect the continuing relevance of the audit evidence from previous audit, the auditor shall test the controls in the current audit. So next we have extent of test of control. The extent of test of control is determined by the judgment of the auditor after considering the materiality, the assessed risk, and the degree of assurance the auditor plans to obtain. So the more reliance the auditor puts on control in his audit, the greater the extent or the amount of the auditor's test of controls. So in addition, as the rate of expected variability of the control increases, the auditors increases the extent of testing of the control. So if the assessed level of control is low, so there will be more extensive testing needed to be performed. However, if the extent of test controls increases as the risk of material misstatement increases. However, increasing the extent of an audit procedure is effective only if the test of control itself is relevant to the specific risk. So next we have effect of control assessment on substantive test. The lower the assessed level of control risk, the less evidence the auditor needs from substantive test. The auditor's control risk assessment influences the nature, timing, and extent of substantive procedures to be performed. So it means if the auditor has obtained evidence that the internal control is functioning effectively, the scope of the auditor's substantive test can be reduced. While on the other hand, if the result of the test of control proves that the internal control is weak, the auditor will have to perform more effective and more extensive substantive procedures. So as the assessed level of control risk decreases, the auditor may modify substantive tests in the following ways. First, changing the nature of substantive tests. For example, using analytical review rather than a detailed substantive testing. Next, changing the timing of substantive tests, such as performing them at an interim date rather than at year end. So next, changing the extent of substantive tests, such as selecting a smaller sample size. Ordinarily, the assessed level of control risk cannot be sufficiently low to eliminate the need to perform any substantive test for all of the financial statement assertions. So, ibig sabihin, regardless of the assessed levels of control risk, whether it is high or low, the auditor should still perform some substantive tests for significant account balances and transaction classes. So, that would be all. Thank you.